Okay, so we're going to resume lesson 2, part 2. So we said we needed to design 3 components for today. We needed a table and a database. We've done that. We need an HTML form to capture the user inputs, and then we've done that. And now we're working on our save page. That's kind of our interface for our bridge between these two, between our form and the database. So I'm just going to comment out this printing of the artist name here. And we've got a number of steps we need to go through here so that we can actually save to the database. So we'll write these steps out as a series of comments, and then we'll flesh out the code kind of bit by bit. So the first thing we're going to need to do is connect to the DB using the Pdo library. With 5 values. They will be the database type, the server, the DB name, the username, and the password. So anytime we connect to a database from PHP, we're going to use this library called Pdo. It stands for PHP Data Objects, and it is the standard. We'll talk a little more about Pdo. And when we go to make this connection, we've got to specify all of these things. What kind of database are we working with? In our case, we're going to be working with MySQL, but we could use other kinds of databases. What is the server address? So for today, we're going to connect to our local server. Next week, once AWS is up and running, we're going to change that connection to use our AWS server instead. The database name, which for today will be PHP Tunes, the database we've created, and then our local username and password. So almost all of these things, except for the DB type, will be changing next week. For today, we're going to use our local server and database. Then we will set up the SQL insert command to add a new record to our artists table. And there's a shortcut way of doing this, and there's a proper way of doing it. We're going to learn the proper way, and I'm going to show you what's wrong with the shortcut way. Then we will populate our SQL command with our form inputs. Execute the save command. We're going to disconnect from the database and show. So these are all the things we need to do here. So it seems like a lot of steps. It kind of is a lot of steps. But once we get used to the mechanics of doing this, all our save pages are going to basically work the same way. We follow this process over and over again until it becomes easy. So first, we're going to start with our connection. I'm going to create a variable just called simply DB. And we are going to create a new instance of a Pdo object. I want to talk for a minute. Yes, absolutely, Akeem, I do. I'll just make a new comment here. So Pdo is the current standard . So years ago, we used to use a library called MySQLi instead. You will still see a lot of resources and material on the internet in tutorials or videos where people use the MySQL library. I do not recommend it for several reasons. Number one, MySQLi, it only lets PHP talk to a MySQL database. That means if you ever change the backend type of your database, you have to rewrite all of the database calls and interactions. Pdo will work with any kind of database, MySQL, SQL Server, or something else. Whereas MySQLi will not. Some students in my morning class asked, well, can we use MySQL in this class? I'm going to say no. And the reason is because all of the code is very, very different. Okay, so PDO has been the standard for several years now. So I'm going to recommend you use PDO. If you want to use MySQLi, you are on your own for doing the coding files because they're going to look extremely different. I'm not going to help you debug or help you with your MySQLi files because it's not the recommended way to do things anymore. So you're free to do it if you want, but you're on your own. So you will see MySQLi, I do not recommend it. So here's our syntax with PDO. First, we've got to supply a data source name. So that involves the first three parameters I've outlined here, the string DSN. We've got to supply the database type, the server, and the database name. So our database type is MySQL followed by a colon. We then set out the host, which could be a server address or IP, server name or IP address. So I'm going to use 127.0.0.1, or you could use the word localhost. Same thing. And then we also need to set the DB name equal. So our first string parameter actually includes three values: the driver, the host IP or server name, and the name of the database we want to connect to. Our last two parameters will be the database username, which locally is root, and the password by default is empty. Alex, no, you don't need the port because 3306 is the default port for MySQL. If you don't supply a port number, it will use 3306 automatically. So you can include the port like this if you want, but you don't need it. Or you could also substitute in localhost if you like. So next week, we're going to wind up changing these four values: the AWS server, our database name, username, and password on AWS. Yeah, if you change the port locally, then you would put in colon and the port number. So there's step one. We'll actually write our disconnect. It's always important to disconnect. We'll talk about why. To disconnect, to destroy our connection, all we do is set it to null. It's important that we disconnect when we're done working with the database on this page. Why? Yes, Alessio, if your MySQL has a password, you would put it in that last parameter where my cursor is blinking. Okay, yeah, that's one reason, Mike. We don't want to leave that database connection. Yep, that's true, Tuani. What about from a performance perspective? Why do we want to close our connections as soon as we're done using them? Do most database servers support unlimited connections? Yeah, exactly, Dominic. Server traffic. Yeah, it's using resources, and if we max out the number of connections, it means the next request that comes in to tries to use the database, that user is going to see this in their browser. It's going to see a blank screen with it spinning. So as soon as we're done saving, we want to disconnect to free up that connection and that memory for some other user. Okay, so to disconnect, we just set it equal to null. So now we're going to set up our SQL. So I'll just create a variable. So we are going to insert into the artists table. And we're going to insert only into the name column. why are we only inserting in the name? Why aren't we inserting into the artist ID as well? Right, because our artist ID is auto-generated or auto-incremented by the database. So what we're going to do, we're going to set up a parameter for the name. Now there's a right way and a wrong way to do this here. I'm going to use this colon name. This colon represents a parameter. Excuse me. Now you will see some people incorrectly write their code like this. This would actually work. I could just take my name variable and inject it directly into my SQL string. This would work, but it is a terrible idea. I never want to see this. If you do this in an assignment, you will lose marks. If you ever see someone injecting form inputs directly into SQL statements, do not follow their code. What's the problem with this? This would be functional to take our variable and dump it in here. But why is this a very dangerous idea? Thank you, Tyler. Can you explain about SQL injection? That is absolutely the problem. What is SQL injection? Yeah, it's not only, Mike, that it doesn't check, but what if I put in an artist name like this? Exactly, Yama, right? I could run, or maybe I run a command, select star from users. If I inject that command with no checking, it's going to run. This is one of the most common hacking attempts out there. So we should never be injecting our form inputs directly into our SQL. So instead, what I'm going to do is use the colon. Yep, that's exactly what it means. So it means people are supplying SQL commands into inputs to try and hijack or wreck your database. So if we use the colon, it means we're setting up a parameter or a placeholder for the name, but we're not directly injecting the variable here. So now we're going to create one other variable that I'll call CMD. And this command allows us to bind our connection and our SQL statement together. So on our database object, we've got a method called prepare. So we're preparing a command on our database with this SQL instruction. Now this doesn't execute the statement yet because we still have to populate our parameter, right? We just have a placeholder here. We now need to attach our variable into the placeholder. So we'll take this command we created, and we've got a built-in method here called, in the Pdo library, called bind param. So we take the parameter name, the variable we want to populate it, and then we specify the data type. And this bind param method also does checking and escaping of SQL commands. So it will automatically protect us against SQL injection. So our parameter is called :name, and we're populating it with the variable called $name. And now we're going to specify the type. PDO has a bunch of enumerators, a bunch of constants. So we're going to use this PDO : param string, which your code editor should recognize. And I'm also going to set my limit at 100 characters. So calling this bind param method, even if the artist name is, drop table artist, it will escape it and treat it like a string now. So it will not execute any SQL commands that a hacker might put in. Okay, Alessio, good question. I'm coming to that. I'm glad you raised that. So this is, most of our PHP code is procedural, but Pdo is object-oriented. So we create a new object here, and prepare is a method of that object. So this symbol looks kind of weird, and same with bind param. What the heck is this dash greater than? In languages that you've already learned, like Java, I'll just put in a comment here. It's the PHP operator. Remember we saw last week, we concatenated a string with the dot. Right? In Java, if we want to call a method on an object, we have object.method or object.property. But PHP already was using dot as a concatenator. So you can't call object.method. So in PHP, when you see this dash greater than, that is calling a method or property of an object. And it's because PHP was designed as a sequential language. It wasn't designed as an object-oriented language. So it's borrowed object-oriented syntax, but stupidly they'd already used the period for concatenation. So the Java equivalent of this would be db.prepare or cmd.bindParam. But we can't use that syntax in PHP. So whenever you see this operator in PHP, it means it's an object and it's calling a method or property on that object. Takes a little while to get used to, but excellent question. So now we're going to use this operator one more time, because up till here, we've set everything up, but the code running to here, it doesn't actually modify the database yet, right? All of this code is set up. Get the input, connect to the database, set up our SQL instruction, prepare it, fill our parameter, and lastly, we're going to use, we're going to make another method call, so we're going to use this stupid operator again. So we'll call CMD, and our command object, it has an execute method. So this actually runs the SQL command. And if we want, it will return values to us. So the actual save happens here. And then lastly, we can just print out artist saved. So now we should be able to try this out and see if we can add some artists to the database. You can add whatever artist you like. So I'm going to try mine out here. So add any artist you like. So I'm going to hit save, and then I'm going to go and query the database and see if anything's in there. If this works, I should get a new artist record with the name Blink-182, and the artist ID should be 5,000 because we set that as our starting increment. Okay. Well, no error, so that's encouraging. But did it actually do anything? Well, now I need to go back to Workbench. What command would I run here now to see the data in the artist table? I can delete what's here. Yeah, or I could just right click and select rows, yeah. Or I can just type select star from artists. And now I've got artist ID 5000 with the name I entered in. Cool. Well, let's go populate a couple more. So I'll save. So if I rerun my query, I've now got 4 records in the database. So this stuff is stored permanently, right? I can turn the computer off, come back next week, and my database is still going to have these here. Okay, if you are getting access denied, your database connection isn't right. What that suggests is when you set up MySQL, you may have put a password on it. Right. So in here, this parameter, you'd need to put it in here. When I set up MySQL, I just accepted I put in the defaults. Okay, if you have an undefined variable, probably you may not have put a semicolon here on the previous line. Okay, Dominic, it's because notice in your error you've got artist singular. We called the table artists plural. So the error message is saying base table not found, phptunes.artist singular. It's artists. Typically, table names by convention are plural. When you hit save on the page, well, it should load a page that says artist saved. I get artist saved. If all this code executes, it should say artist saved. If nothing's appearing in Workbench, no database selected. Okay, invalid catalog name. So this means, I think, Mike, you may have missed this part of the connection string. You've got to set up db name equals and point it to your database name. So if it's saying no database selected, it doesn't know which database to connect to. Right. Yep, it's an equals. It's okay. It's good we get some of these errors because, if you have one of these errors and you fix it, you're more likely to avoid it next time. Well, Tawani, we're not really going to use our local database. We're going to use our AWS database. It's just that it's not working today. But yeah, I mean, if you're using a different port, it's totally fine. Call to a member function prepare on null. Okay, so it's failing here. So what's probably happening is your database connection is failing somehow. You done? It's probably saying you can't call prepare on DB because somehow something's wrong in your connection string. So double check your connection string. I will push this stuff to Git as well, so you can double check it, but keep in mind your connection string might be different than mine. For example, if you have a password. Okay, so I've re-uploaded. So the code we've done is on GitHub, if you need to reference it. Now, I know some people are still having errors. I can stick around and help debug. Does anybody have any questions, though, about what's happening here? Okay, notice we specify. Well, normally we don't put it right in here. Normally we put this in a separate file entirely. And depending on our hosting environment, we might be able to, some hosts have like a configuration section where we can read it out of there. I don't think we'll have access to that with AWS. I could show you what it looks like in a different place. So here's a cloud service you guys might use in your JavaScript frameworks class. And show you the configuration section. I just have to log in. But I'll show you what a hosting config might look like for your So you may have something like this where you get configuration variables in the hosting panel, and you would specify things like your password here. I don't think we'll have access to do this in this class. So in our class, yes, it will be just in our application code. But later we'll also move this, because we're going to use this same connection in like almost every file in the site. Later we'll move this to its own file and link it, as opposed to repeating the connection over and over again, which is really inefficient and not very scalable. Excellent question. So I want to do one other thing with this for today, not essential, but useful, which is let's clean up the look at this. Have you guys, I'm not sure in your HTML class if you worked with Bootstrap at all. Did you work with Bootstrap in Jeremy's class? You did. Okay. So I want to download and add Bootstrap. Yeah, okay, a little bit. So let's go and grab it, and then we can add a little bit of style, add some few style components to our app. So if we just go to, I'll put the link in the chat, but if you go to getbootstrap.com, from the home page, if you click on download, brings us here. And if I'm going to download these, and I'm going to save them, save the Bootstrap bundle. You can see the path, so I'll go to C, XAMPP, htdocs. I'm going to save it into my PHP tunes. All right, good on your Raj. So I'm going to save the Bootstrap bundle here. I'm going to extract it. I can delete my zip file. And I'm just going to move, let's see, I'm going to move the CSS and JS folders just into the root. I'm just going to drag them. I don't need a folder called Bootstrap. So I just got a CSS and JS folder right here. And then I'll just get rid of that empty Bootstrap folder. So now I've got the Bootstrap CSS and JavaScript files right in my root. Yeah, Akeem, you can use the CDN. The CDN is more efficient. It's a little easier. The downside of the advantage of downloading it locally is I'll get the code hinting in my project. So when I type class equals in Visual Studio Code or WebStorm, it's going to recognize all the classes. When you use the CDN, your code editor doesn't read the classes. So you absolutely, if you want to just use the CDN, for sure, you can just copy the CSS and JavaScript links. Absolutely. But when you do, you don't get the code hinting, which I like. So I'm going to go back to my artist details. So I'm going to link so now my link is going to be CSS, and I will just get the minified bootstrap.min.css. If you want, you could put the CDN here. So now I can, even just by including my CSS right away, right? You see my font changes. And now I can apply a few styles to our basic form. I'll use form-group. Actually, I'm surprised I didn't thought I would get the code hinting, but I didn't. Not sure why. Weird. And maybe I'll make this my label, call-2. Then I can apply a few styles on my button. I'll use a blue button. And I want to move the button over so it's underneath my text box. We'll see how this looks. I don't want it this wide. So I'll just play around. Actually, I'll maybe take out this form control. There. I might also add a little margin, top margin to my button. Top margin. Those move it down. So yes, Keem, absolutely you could use the CDN if you want. It's also jammed up in the top left. Maybe I'll wrap this whole thing. Oops. Inside my body, I'm going to add a main tag. So all of the content of our page can live inside. And that should give me a little bit of spacing. It moves it over a little bit. It's not jammed right in the top left of the screen. So we'll do more with Bootstrap as we go. In fact, I think I'm going to add it to the home page as well. We'll also clean up some of the content on our home page. our index.php, where we were kind of mucking around last week with variables. Maybe we'll write some more useful content there. And we'll just add Bootstrap. And then we're going to call it a day. And I can stick around in the room and help anybody debug who's having trouble. So our home page, it looks like this. So I'm going to replace this content with a description of our website. And I also want to add Bootstrap to it. I'm going to go to, I'll copy my Bootstrap link from my artist details. And I'm going to take out the PHP that we did last week. It's not very useful. Again, I'll create a main section. And put the content inside. And we'll describe what this is. So our site is built for our course. Will be hosted on Amazon Web Services. And later on, I'll also put a link to the source code up on GitHub. I'll leave that for now. So now our site we'll leave that for now. I'll just push these changes up to Git one more time. We're adding Bootstrap. Okay, so I think, Alessio, you still need PHP tunes, right? Because it's the home page for this site. If you go just to localhost, it goes to your dashboard. It's localhost/PHP tunes. Okay, so all the code we've done is on GitHub. Your quiz should open at 3 o'clock today. It'll be open until Sunday. So your checklist for this week. To lesson 2. So, oops, this should be, say, artists. Make sure you've created an artists table. That you followed the class exercise, so you've built the form, and save, and make sure you complete the quiz by Sunday night at midnight. So what we will do next week is we're going to work on querying the database so that we can retrieve artist data and display it in the browser. Okay, so that's everything I wanted to cover today. I'm going to stop the video. If everything is working for you, you're free to go. If you need some help from me, then I'm happy to stay in the WebEx room and help you debug. Okay. If you have questions, you can also send me an email. I also have office hours appointments, so you're free to book an office hour appointment with me.